Hi, everyone. I'm Rusty Dunn, and once again, we are digging into history here at Caterpillar. What a pleasure to be with my good friend and colleague, our chief heritage storyteller, Lee Fosberg, out here at the archives. It's great to be with you.
Good to see you again, Rusty.
Unbelievable that Caterpillar is in its 97th year now, and such great moments in history, a million stories to tell, and we're going to do it again today if you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right, let's set this up. In 1925, Holtz and Best merged their companies to form Caterpillar, and one of the key strategic priorities for them was to consolidate any duplication from the two predecessor companies. And what we're going to learn today is their early decision and planning around parts and services and looking into the future, establishing a dealer network. It was really an early template for the success that we've realized over the decades. So one of the first things they did, they put together a blue ribbon committee, yes?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that word, right? Blue ribbon committee. They don't use that anymore. But consolidation is the word of the day, right? You had to consolidate your product line, but more importantly, you had to consolidate things like your dealer network. You had former Holt, you had former Best dealers. You maybe needed to do new dealers, but you had to also consolidate things like your parts and your services that you were providing. So they created, what we called a Blue Ribbon Committee, which was made up of various people at Caterpillar that were really kind of from the higher ranks of the new company.
One of the gentlemen was R.C. Force. He was the first CEO of Caterpillar. Who else was on that committee?
Besides R.C. Force, who, think about, you had the person who was leading the company. He was the head of the committee, but you also had a person called B.C. Heacock. He was actually our second president, what we would call the CEO today. A person called Louis Newmiller, who was actually a head of parts and the dealers at that time, but he would become actually our third CEO. There was another person called H.P. Mee. He wrote a very famous work, Across the Table, which kind of set the standards of how our dealer network would run. But the last person was an illustrator whose name was Virgil Unks, and he kind of was, you would see, the creative person.
Okay, so these were the visionaries for this young company, seeing a world of possibilities. But let's go back to Virgil Unks for a second. He was the illustrator, as you mentioned, in the group, and he came up with some really interesting illustrations.
That's right, Rusty. So he came up with 4 illustrations. But another interesting thing he did, he actually designed our first service pin, and he also designed safety cartoons that would run in things like Caterpillar publications to keep our employees safe.
Amazing. So think about this, and the designer of the initial service pins, which we still are very proud of today and wear proudly. Let's get into these 4 drawings. Let's start with drawing what we'll call drawing number 1, called Farmer Broken Down, 1 day left for combining.
This one, you could say, this guy has a problem. He's a customer, his tractor broke down, and we were very much an agricultural company at that time. So if you couldn't get your crop out of the field, you were in big trouble. So what does he do? He calls his dealer through a television. We assume it's like a television kind of phone, right?
And the fact that television had been invented just some years before, in the 20s.
In the 20s.
This was 1930.
So he's calling his dealer, and he's like, I'm in big trouble, which leads to our second illustration.
Yeah, and this is just called Dealer's Office, Part Service Control Room. Talk about what we're seeing here.
So there's a great image of the farmer on the other end of the screen, apparently in black and white. It wasn't
color television yet.
No. And there's like a contraption that looks like kind of a computer, though it's very interesting that the dealer is using like a hard copy, which looks like a parts catalog to feed into the computer. But you'll also see there was a barometer there that is tracking your orders and where you're at with inventory, kind of very similar if you went to one of our distribution facilities today. So he's entering that information.
And let me know that helmet-like device he's wearing, sort of that brain-computer interface, which is really interesting.
And that's going to our third illustration, which you would say is kind of picking the part.
Mechanical storeroom, remotely controlled.
So you have, it looks like a mechanical picking arm that's taking from what the second illustration is requesting to putting it on a conveyor belt, which is then being picked up by a dealer employee who's putting it on a plane, which you assume is for delivery. It's also very interesting if you look at some of the parts there, there's no different than today. There's sprockets, they're like engine rods. Things are very fundamental to our equipment.
So now we've got to get the part to the farmer. So drawing
Yep.
number 4, season's profit saved by 25 minutes.
That's right. You see the plane in the air. Now it's parachuting
Early
a part
drone.
down. So apparently Virgil Unks didn't make his safety cartoons this early in the process. So the farmer is like very happy it's coming down and he's going to be able to put it in his tractor. And you would say the season has been saved.
And airdropped 25 minutes after the customer's call for service. So even back then, they're thinking about specific times and getting it to them when they need it. Wow, talk about visionaries and illustrations taking us through the whole process from the time the customer needs it to the time he or she gets it.
That's right. And he's also using a phrase by Cracky. I had to almost like Google that and look that up. What does that mean today, right? So
and
anytime you can work that in, it's like a good thing.
It's rare when you hear that said.
Yeah.
Right. So what came true? I mean, talk about visionaries and trying to predict the future. What sort of came true?
Well, what's interesting, the airplane is one of the things that came true. And one of our dealers in California, they would say within a 40-mile radius of the dealership that they could deliver within 1 hour the part. And they did it, and they followed through with it. And the other thing that came through was the barometer of tracking. That was an idea by Louis Newmiller. And we use something kind of very similar to that today to track things like parts.
By Cracky, a surprise. There was a fifth, so there was another drawing. There was a fifth drawing called Earthworm City.
Earthworm City. And first of all, the word earthworm, like, why weren't they calling this caterpillar? And part of the reason was there were very popular stories that came out in the Saturday Evening Post about this kind of this company called Earthworm Tractors, and it was actually by a person called William Hazelton Upson. And what these stories were about, he worked at one time for Holt. So he loosely based these stories, which were kind of comical, on his time at Holt. So it became very popular then, right, that they would play off of that. So they called this Earthworm City, which people would relate to back then.
And Virgil saw it fit to put the faces of the committee members on these people.
Right, it's kind of like we have a big project at a company today, and you always, when it's completed and it's completed successfully, you have a closure. And I kind of think this represents kind of a closure.
So a couple of other examples of how, in the past, they were looking into the future. We've done this all along, haven't we?
Absolutely. Like one of the things I think of, right, like what we call like blade control today, right, which are AccuGrade, things like that. The company in the 1970s was actually conceiving this, even before there was like satellites doing GPS. The other thing would be autonomy. In the early 1980s, people were looking at things of how autonomy could be applied to our equipment. I think very famously, Don Feitz, one of our former CEOs, said in the 90s, at one time he believed that in the future our machines could communicate back and forth.
Connected assets, yeah.
Yeah, right? Which I think we have like 1.2 million connected assets today. So our success is really based upon, you could say, this early kind of the things in the past that we, kind of leveraged and are doing today.
Well, when you think about going from steam to gas to diesel to now we talk about the energy transition.
Yeah.
And perhaps, would that be some sort of hydrogen-powered products, that sort of thing. It's just, and we're just now in that time.
Absolutely.
Continuing to look forward.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that our DNA, right, maybe goes back to these early endeavors by, our essentially Caterpillar's founding fathers.
Yeah.
Right?
Of course, still looking forward to the future today. And while neither of us can probably promise that we'll be here 50 years from now still digging into history, perhaps someone by Cracky will come in and be talking about what happened in 2022. You never know. But thanks so much. Really fascinating. A million stories to be told here out at the archive. So we appreciate it, Lee.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thanks for watching, everyone. As always, be safe in everything you do. We'll see you soon.